This week on The Wheelhouse, you're going to get a history lesson. A lesson in Connecticut history. I'm Frankie Graziano, and we're doing things a little differently today on The Wheelhouse. You know, the show that brings politics to the people. And we don't think you can understand today's political climate without first understanding our past. For today's episode, we're going to travel back in time to 1969 and revisit what some have called one of the most significant political trials of the century. I'm talking about the trial of the New Haven Nine, members of the Black Panther Party accused of murdering Alex Rackley, another member of the party that was falsely suspected of being an FBI informant.
There isn't a day that goes by that I do not think of Alex Rackley.
Over the next hour, we'll unpack everything from how the federal government targeted Black Panther Party leaders to the trial's legacy in New Haven today. And here to help us break it down, all that is Mercy Quaye, CEO of the Narrative Project and host of the podcast Revolution on Trial. Just a dandy of a podcast. Thank you so much for doing it, exploring the history of the New Haven Black Panthers. Good morning.
Good morning, Frankie, and thanks for having me.
Paul Bass, founder of the New Haven Independent and co-author of Murder in the Model City, The Black Panthers, Yale, and the Redemption of a Killer. A very important book to read from Paul. Thank you so much for coming on this morning on The Wheelhouse.
Thanks for having me on.
Paul, you're going to get the first question. Take us back to May 17, 1969. That's the day 19-year-old Alex Rackley was kidnapped. What happened to him?
Well, he had come up to New Haven. He was brought along with another member of the Black Panther Party from New York to the headquarters of the New Haven Black Panther Party in the city of New Haven on Orchard Street. And it was a time of high paranoia. The local police and the FBI had red squads in every city that were infiltrating chapters of the Black Panther Party. The head of the FBI had described them as the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States, which probably was off by a factor of 10,000, but that was his assessment. And that kind of elevated them in their eyes as a threat. So before Alex Rackley was brought to New Haven, there had been a big bust in New York where they claimed they broke up a plot to bomb a Corvette store. And turns out the New York chapter was just full of spies, police informants, and all these people were standing trial. So an enforcer from the party in New York named George Sands brought Rackley up for a trial in New Haven about whether he had been one of the informants. And he had left a home in Florida. He was 19 years old. He didn't really wear shoes. He wasn't really a very with it guy, but he was with the party. And they had no evidence. And in his death, it was clear that Black Panther Party immediately after his death said he was not a spy. But they brought him downstairs in Orchard Street where the headquarters was. And for hours, they poured pots of boiling water over him, tied him to a chair to try to get him to confess to being a spy. And they hit him in the head with guns and things like that. And there's a recording of it, which of course is very suspicious because later police knew exactly where that recording was. So obviously someone in that room was an informant. And it was one of those terrible kind of show trials you read about. And you'd hear him, getting tortured. And then for days afterwards, he was left tied to a bed in his own feces until a few nights later, they drove him to a field in Middlefield at night, shot him in the head and left him in the river. And that became the pretext for what the FBI was waiting for, which is to try to eliminate the leadership of the Black Panther Party. So the individuals who were actually involved in killing Alex Rackley, 3 of them, were pretty summarily found guilty. 2 of them cooperated with the state. 1 of them was found guilty of trial. So people actually committed the murder. That wasn't an issue. But they tried to get on conspiracy the national head of the party, Bobby Seale, and Erica Huggins, who had come to New Haven. There's a long story about why at the time, but she was a leader of the party, and there was no evidence at all to tie them to the murder. So their trial became a cause célèbre for radicals across the country. And in 1970, and let me know, Frankie, if I'm going into too much detail.
Yeah, let me just bring in Mercy. Let me just bring in Mercy from here because I want to hear from her and have her give us some added context. Mercy Quaye, CEO of the Narrative Project, Revolution on Trial, host. Mercy, for context, you just heard Paul say that there was something suspicious about the ability to have that torture tape, essentially. The FBI had been carrying out a massive spying operation on Black Panthers across the country around this time. Why?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things that I found from my reporting on Revolution on Trial is that Panthers here in New Haven and Panthers throughout the country were being surveilled through a program that we now know is called COINTELPRO. And this was a huge apparatus to bring down the party. Here in New Haven, you have Panthers like George Edwards being wiretapped and followed. And as Paul mentioned, the entirety of the scope was to try to bring down the leaders of the party, Erica Huggins and Bobby Seale. And so there were a number of individuals who were followed. George Edwards, who, was from New Haven, lived in New Haven, and only recently passed away, tells a story in the podcast about how he could tell. He knew that his phone was tapped, and he knew that he was being followed. He knew that he knew the individuals that were following him. And the entirety of the process was to sow confusion and doubt inside the party.
I was assaulted. I was falsely arrested. I was set up by New Haven police officers as a conveying a threat to assassinate President Lyndon Johnson in 1968, right inside the police station. They made, 10,000, hit them with this. Bam!
Mercy, can you give us a sense of the strength of New Haven's Black Panther chapter in the 1960s and 70s? Can you just give us an idea of what it was like for members in the New Haven area?
Yeah, so if you were in the New Haven area in the 1960s and 70s, what you could come to expect from the Black Panther Party was after-school programs working with the Hill Parents Association, morning breakfast programs, programs for young people, programs for senior citizens, and mostly around education. Effectively, the tenets of the Black Panther Party on a national level were brought here to New Haven. And in talking with Erica Huggins, effectively how she describes it is that there was already a mass of people doing activist work here in New Haven through the Hills Parents Association. And so they reached out to Erica to see if they can get a formal party started, for a formal chapter started here in New Haven. And so if you listen to the podcast, one of the things that she talks about is there wasn't a need to bring the party to New Haven. Tenets of the party, principles of the party were already sort of active here in a large way.
I didn't need to find the people because there were people already wanting to join the Black Panther Party. It was that time in history where everything was moving and everyone wanted to contribute to movement. And
we should note the reason she came to New Haven was her husband was John Huggins, who grew up in New Haven.
That's right.
They were party leaders at UCLA, and there was a fight with another Black nationalist group, Ron Karenga's group, and there was a shootout in the cafeteria over allegedly who was going to control the student organization. It was later determined that the people fired the guns were actually FBI informants, and they killed John Huggins. And Erica brought his body back at St. Luke's Church and stayed here. And they started in Bridgeport and then New Haven to start a chapter while she was here.
And so at that time, we're talking about a really young Erica Huggins who, was bringing her husband's body back along with their child. And so a young mother at the time during the trials, and a young mother bringing back the body here to New Haven, it was a time, a lot of things that we think about when we think about Panthers or young activists is we forget that they're young, right? We forget that they were in their teens. Alex Rackley himself was 19 at the time. Erica Huggins was 19, 20 at the time. And so we're talking about really young people doing this kind of work here in New Haven.
Just to go back a little bit, though, I just want to kind of underscore this, the importance of Black Panthers in the communities they operate in. Why would a Hill Parents Association be so into getting Erica Huggins to start a chapter here and to really support having the Panthers in New Haven?
I think some of the things that we know about New Haven around the time is Black communities were not being invested in. I think education of Black young people was not being invested in. And so the same sort of tenets on a national level were the thing for the Black Panther Party were the same things that they wanted to bring here. Every man should have access to a meal, bread for everyone, right?
Until the Panthers came here, there really was very little radical activity in New Haven compared to other cities because there was so much anti-poverty money swimming in the city. New Haven had the largest per capita, in addition to large per capita illegal wiretapping, we had the largest per capita flow of federal government and foundation money to try to get rid of poverty and test the programs that became the foundation of the Great Society. So we were the city that was supposed to eradicate poverty. And a lot of people who might have been activists against the system were getting money. And I think around the time, it was after King's murder, around the time of the sense that it was coming up short, and that some of the people who joined the Panthers from New Haven, like Warren Kimbrough, who was leader of the chapter, felt that after working within the system, that they concluded that the people who said they want to help poor communities, the Black community, were actually trying to still control them under new ways and use anti-poverty money to keep themselves in power and to prevent self-empowerment in the community and building up of own kind of enterprises owned by the Black community. So I think there was also a moment when Erica came to town, when New Haven was starting to have a hangover from the Great Society. You know, we tested out legal aid. We knocked down more buildings per capita of slums to try to build new homes, and that didn't quite work out. People ended up poorer than when we started. So I think there was this confluence of factors that made it a moment, because the Panthers weren't here that long. They were only here 6 months when this murder occurred. And afterwards, there was a lot of focus on the trial for a couple of years. But I think that was really the context in which a more radical look at the system that was creating poverty, holding people back, was supplanting a more reform vision of just improving the institutions we have.
2 members of the local Black Panther Party admitted to Rackley's murder. The name you just mentioned, Warren Kimbrough and George Sams, yet 9 defendants indicted on charges related to the case. Who else was implicated in Rackley's death and why?
Well, there was one other person who actually participated in it, who was Lonnie McLucas, and he was found guilty. The rest, as I said earlier, was the FBI was trying to take out the leadership of the party. So they used conspiracy card. They want the death penalty. They tried to get the death penalty for Bobby Seale, who was the president of the National Party, and Erica Huggins, who was the leader here, with really no evidence. And, it was so clear in trial that even the judge, who was a conservative white judge who had made many comments disparaging of Black people, ended the trial very sympathetic to Erica Huggins and Bobby Seale. And the trial really was a Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins. And it was sort of a historic trial in that, as the president of Yale put at the time, it tested whether a Black revolutionary could get a fair trial in America. People came from all over the country to protest it. They shut down Yale for 4 days in May. They had big rallies on the Green. The place was crawling with National Guardsmen who had orders that they would not get in trouble if they shot anyone dead. And 4 days after that rally was when Kennedy happened, and unarmed protesters were shot dead by the National Guard. So there was a feeling that President Nixon wanted a city to blow, and they wanted it to be New Haven. And this will go a little off track, there was this bizarre conspiracy behind the scenes among the Black Panthers, Yale, the city police, all these people who were attacking each other during daylight were uniting to stop that bloodbath from happening here when all the radicals came to protest on May 1st, and they prevented violence. Like Bobby Seale sent a tape from prison that broadcast from a car to urge people not to do something stupid and start some kind of violence that'd be an excuse for the National Guard to have a bloodbath here. And that was one of the great stories of the period. But then obviously Jackson State on May 2nd, and then Kent State University on May 4th had a sadder outcome.
You talked about the ability for people to get a fair trial around this time. What about women being able to get a fair trial at this time? There's a big moment in the trial, obviously, where Erica Huggins really struggles to get a word in and has to spell it out for the defense attorney who she says is badgering her. So I just want to kind of now get into Mercy, the role of women in organizing, particularly for racial and social justice at that time, what it's like to be an Erica Huggins around 19, 20, 21 years old.
Yeah, so what's actually interesting is more than most social movements, the Black Panther Party really valued the inside of women. They were able to kind of climb up the ranks of the party, similar to the men to how the men were. And so that was one thing that we could see in the party that we weren't able to see in sort of other places of social justice movements. But that doesn't mean that they weren't experiencing the same kind of sexism, the same kind of treatment that women elsewhere weren't receiving, right? So one of the things Erica talks about is that because she was married to John, she had privileges that other women in the party wouldn't have access to. And so she was seen as a leader of a party just as John was. But even now, when we're talking about women activists and organizers, there is this unequal burden on the backs of women organizers and some of the organizers that I've talked to for the podcast, where they're talking about not being respected in the same way, given the worst jobs in activism or organizing. That looks like doing on the ground organizing, but also childcare, right? And so more than men in the party, there was this sort of unequal burden of the weight of the party, for sure.
Paul, any evidence tying Seal or Huggins to the murder?
Well, there's absolutely none for Seal. He'd been visiting town to give a speech, and that was clear. The only thing with Huggins, her big challenge at trial was actually the Black Panthers, and we want to talk about sexism. So there were two key moments at which feminism, this became an early feminist trial, and her attorney was Catherine Rohrbeck, who was a pioneering feminist radical lawyer in New Haven. So Seal's attorney, Charles Gary, decided to try to get Seal off by blaming it on Erica. And that became clear during the trial because she had been in the room when they left to go kill Alex Rackley and put him in a car. They actually used a spy's car to do that. They didn't even know that. So the police knew they were driving off. So at the trial, on the one hand, Rohrbeck found out that because they were going to try to use that. So then the state, you brought this moment up earlier. Erica's point was going to be, their point was, if you were leader of the party, how could this have happened without you giving the order? Which isn't evidence, obviously, but that's the closest they got to evidence. And her point, they had a brilliant strategy, was to show that women weren't heard the same way. So this guy, George Sams, the enforcer, comes from New York, and he did commandeer the interrogation, although Erica's on the tape being pretty brutal to Alex Rackley during the interrogation. So the prosecutor's named Arnie Markle. He was very aggressive. So they were laying a trap for him. When Erica was going to testify about how she couldn't be heard, they were going to let him continue on being aggressive without Rohrbeck objecting. And then finally, after he let Erica speak, she said, well, you realize, Mr. Markle, that it's hard for a woman to be heard when a man is in the room. And that was it. So their only attempt at having evidence, which wasn't very good evidence, was blown out of the water by a really clever early feminist strategy in the courtroom to combat the extra burden that women face.
This effort to tie Seal and Huggins to the murder and really what happens afterwards, I want to kind of button this up really quickly as we're up against a break here. Is this part of wider efforts from the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO? And I got to say, is it working when you see the defense here, the defense here have to decide between whether or not they're going to support Seal or Huggins? Maybe there's a little bit of dissension there.
The evil of COINTELPRO was to criminalize dissent, to make you so paranoid if you dare to question the government that you'll never know whom you can trust, so it becomes impossible to effectively protest. So you had a fact that I was able to ascertain that much of the New Haven chapter was spies. Alex Rackley was not one of them. But nobody could ever know whom they can trust if they're going around what should be an all-American activity, questioning the government. So the paranoia, the suspicion, they actually had a class in teaching white FBI agents in New Haven how to sound black when they wrote fake flyers and letters to members of the Black Panthers, pretending to be other Black Panthers and telling them that they'd seen the other one have sex with their partners, or telling the people in the Black community how dangerous they felt the Black Panthers were their community. Sow that suspicion, sow that doubt, fuel that paranoia, and that helped criminalize dissent, not just with the Black Panthers, but with a lot of protest movements in America at the time.
And it's actually also important to understand that this was coming down directly from the top, right? FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover at the time issued directives for COINTELPRO, and the specific order was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of these movements. And so it was incredibly important. It's incredibly important to understand how high up in the FBI this came down. And when you look at that juxtaposition, you're looking at the Federal Bureau of Investigations, right? The pinnacle of investigations for America at the time, targeting teenagers and young adults for Black liberation movements, right? That juxtaposition isn't something that made sense now, let alone at the time.
This is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Thank you for tuning in. We'll have more on the New Haven Black Panther trials after a short break. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. All hour, we're revisiting the New Haven Black Panther trials and how they reverberate in New Haven today. I got two great guests with me. Mercy Quaye, CEO of the Narrative Project and host of the podcast Revolution on Trial, that explores the history of the New Haven Black Panthers, and Paul Bass, the founder of the New Haven Independent and co-author of Murder in the Model City, the Black Panthers, Yale, and the Reduction of a Killer. We want to play a clip, and I'm going to play this for Mercy. It's from Erica Huggins speaking to Lucy Nalpathanchel on Where We Live a few years ago. Here's that clip for Mercy.
This was deeper than anything I could have imagined.
Mercy, where's Erica Huggins now, and what has her life been like since the trials in New Haven?
Yeah, so she lives in Oakland with her daughter, and as Paul mentioned, she opened a school. She's still deeply invested in education, and she is still deeply invested in sort of the Black liberation movements of the day. What we talked a great deal about, and what she cares a great deal about right now, is sort of looking at Ahmaud Arbery and looking at the case of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. I talked to her. I had the privilege of really talking to her right as those moments were happening. And she was saying that these are the things that we underwent in the 60s and 70s, and that they're still happening today, and that activists and Black organizers are still having to undergo surveillance and wiretapping and the same sort of issues that she had to face during that time. For her is deplorable, and she is a person that is available for conversations like the ones that we had, and she's still working in education with her school, and she's a gem. She really is just a fantastic gem, and she's excited to talk about these issues.
This economy was built on owning humans that look like you and me. I believe that we need to reimagine the way in which we handle harm. There are countries in the world that do it already with community programs rather than jails and prisons. We have such a punitive, arcaic, inhumane way of handling humans who, whether they've committed harm or not, that are accused of harming. And we have, on the other hand, officers of the law in the streets, in the courts, behind the judges' benches, in the correctional institutions that are participating in a harmful system.
What's the legacy of the Black Panther Party today? I know, I think officially it ends in the early 80s, or at least as Paul says, it kind of peters out. But what's the legacy, especially in terms of the social programs it pioneered?
So I'll say it's complicated, and it depends on who you are. I think that for most Black people, the Black Panther Party is an example of what can happen when Black intellectuals put together a Marxist platform and say, what happens when we apply ourselves for the betterment of ourselves? But that's not always the case. That's not always how they're viewed. I think that lots of white Americans view the party as Black radicals who are out to, murder and maim white people. And that is just not the case. I think that when it comes to a younger generation of Black liberation movement believers, they look back at the party and recognize them as those individuals who show us an example of what it looks like to advocate for yourself and show you that things that like carrying a gun is a right that is afforded to the average American citizen and should be afforded to Black American citizens. They are a party that young activists today look up to for the way that they organize, for the way that they value women, for the way that they valued education, for the way that they valued taking care of a community as a first step of activism and looking inwardly as opposed to looking outward.
Yeah, and a word that people might use to describe the Black Panthers historically, and I don't think I think it's more of a pejorative term, but I'm not sure if you hear this when you're thinking about a different group of people that wear similar things, right? When you're organizing, you may wear the same kind of thing. People may get together and wear the same kind of thing, but if it's the Proud Boys, they might not get the word like this or something like that. The word I'm looking for is militant. What do you think about that phrase?
I think militant was applied to them at the time. I think that when we see parallels in the imagery between the Black Panther parties and today, when we look at Beyonce's Super Bowl performance and how she came out with leather jackets and Black berets, she was called militant. And I actually am someone who, doesn't think that the word militant is a bad one when we're talking about the liberation or the movement for Black lives. I don't think that militant is a bad one. I think that what we should do is reframe our understanding of what it means to be militant when we're saying things like Black Lives Matter. That is absolutely okay. I think what they were up against at the time was a narrative that they could not reverse. And it was that if you were a dissenter of any kind, that the government could be on your back in any moment. And this was a time when free speech for Black people wasn't afforded to them, right? And words like militant came about to scare people, Black people who were just sort of minding their business away from participating in the Black Panther Party or other liberation movements, for sure.
Very important commentary there from Mercy, particularly about the New Haven Black Panther trials, raising a lot of questions about police surveillance, systemic racism, the justice system. Paul, give me an idea of what this meant for the legacy of May Day and the Panther trials on the city of New Haven.
So people who are still alive have never forgotten that day. People talk about the tanks rolling down the street and what a jarring sight that was. People who participate talked about the unity in the face of threats. And it was a defining moment for our city. It was a defining moment of the criminal justice system about whether Black revolutionaries can get a fair trial. It was a defining moment of whether the federal government can wipe out dissent. And it also was a way for our city to step back from a long period of urban renewal in which we weren't able to wipe out poverty. We weren't able to bring about justice through government programs and re-examine how we could do a better job.
Mercy, in your podcast, you say this.
If you talk to them, the women who were there around the time would say it was because the police and the government took their sons and husbands. So who else was left to fight?
Are Black women often the ones left to fight even to this day, Mercy?
Even to this day, we see the effects of mass incarceration and the war on drugs impacting our communities. And one of the things that Ala Chamare or Carrie Ellington, some of the individuals that I interviewed for the podcast would tell you today is when all else fails and there aren't men left to defend our communities, that oftentimes it has to be the Black women, the moms, the aunties, the grandmas who do things that look different from the fight of yesteryear, right? It looks like going to Board of Education meetings. It looks like speaking up in public comment at your Board of Elders meetings. It looks like giving testimony up at legislative session. And what we see time and time again even with some of the organizations that I worked with here at the Narrative Project, is the people who are most involved in these political movements are women. And the people that I see who care the most about the movement for Black lives, whether that is on a national level or here in Connecticut, the leaders of these movements are not men anymore, they're women.
People showing up, people like Carrie Ellington. I would have seen her a while back as I was out more actively reporting in person, seeing her at events like protesting ICE detentions out there. Saw her at something that you talked about in your podcast after Stephanie Washington was shot and Paul Witherspoon was shot at by Hamden police and Yale police. Carrie Ellington on the front line in the shooting of that event. She's somebody that's in your podcast. Any other names that we should think about who are some of these community organizers working in New Haven today?
Absolutely. Folks like Ala Archimare, who was one of the founders of the of the New Haven Black Lives Matter chapter, and individuals who are taking up the mantle of organizing, like Addis Castillo, who up until recently was the executive director of Citywide Youth Coalition and has gone on to greater things. But we're also talking about art activism, individuals like Quaye Ade, who is a muralist here in New Haven and takes individuals from the history of New Haven, like Edward Boucher, and paints these amazing murals on the sides of buildings in urban areas around the city, and is responsible for the Black Lives Matter mural on Temple Street here in New Haven. So there are a number of individuals who are taking up the mantle of activism here in New Haven, and that fight continues. And the way that we see it continue looks a lot different than what it looked like in the 70s. Right now, it looks like making sure that the thumb remains on the temperature of the community and say, what issues do you care about today? And how can we bring that to the steps of City Hall? And how can we bring that to the steps of the police department and ensure that no matter what happens, whether that is a Randy Cox situation, a Stephanie Washington situation, right? No matter what happens, that folks in our community have representatives who will help them organize and turn out people to say enough is enough.
Paul, last year, George Edwards, one of New Haven's first Black Panther members, the person who worked at SNET and came to the Black Panthers talking about phones being tapped. He died last year. Tell us about his life and activism, especially what he meant for New Haven in the years after the trials, Paul.
He came from the South. He'd been a nuclear engineer with the military, and he got radicalized when Malcolm X came to New Haven. He was in theater, and he got involved in activism, and he stayed true to his beliefs in the face of incredible repression. When you look at his FBI file, he got tortured by his own party, and he got messed with by the federal government. They were always trying to scare him, so the paranoia. The night Alex Rackley was killed, George Edwards was supposed to be in the car and killed as well, a suspected informer, which he wasn't. And they didn't find him, so he didn't get killed. But then the government arrested him as though he had been in on the murder. So he gets sent to prison for having allegedly committed this murder in which he was supposed to be the victim. That didn't last long, he got out of that. And he remained to the end of his life. He out-survived the people who were looking to kill him.
Mercy, the final word here. We're more than 50 years out from the New Haven Black Panther trials. Why should Connecticut residents still care about what happened then? Why should we be talking about this on the Wheelhouse?
I think it is an example of what happens when a government decides that they are going to wage a war against a people begging for freedom. It is a conversation that doesn't end because we see things like Ron DeSantis ending funding for diversity programs. We see supports for women being rolled back time and time again. We see, and when supports for women, when abortion is rolled back in this country, the women who are most negatively impacted are women of color and specifically Black women. I think this is a conversation that maintains today because we need to be a people that keeps our eyes and ears open and available to the change of the tides and understands when our government is not holding our best interests at heart, there needs to be a people that is willing to stand up against it.
Thanks to Paul and Mercy for joining us all hour and giving us really important context, a really important Connecticut history lesson on the New Haven Black Panthers and why this trial reverberates even today. We'll link to both Paul's book and Mercy's podcast on our website. Want to make sure you hear the podcast, read the book. Thank you so much to them for coming on the show. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. Today's show produced by Meg Dalton. Thank you so much for the show, Meg. Technical producers are Katie Tolarski and Kat Pastor. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. If you're just joining us, we're diving deep into the New Haven Black Panther trials and how they resonate today. Still with me, Mercy Quaye, CEO of the Narrative Project. She also hosts the podcast Revolution on Trial that explores the history of what we're talking about today, the New Haven Black Panther Party. Paul Bass, founder of the New Haven Independent and co-author of Murder in the Model City, the Black Panthers, Yale, and the Redemption of a Killer. Paul, if they'd been convicted, the New Haven Nine would have faced the death penalty. Did that add to heightened tensions over this trial as people are fighting for their life?
Remember, the key people are the two. It's Erica Huggins and Bobby Seale. It was the death penalty for them that the government was seeking without evidence, and that sure did heighten tensions because there was a well-founded feeling in the country that there was a war on radicals and dissenters, even though they didn't know yet about COINTELPRO. As Mercy pointed out, they kind of felt it and knew it. And this idea that they wanted to murder, kill people that there wasn't evidence against as an effort to take out Leisure Party, that sent ripples throughout the country, throughout the movements, and not just the Black Panther movement, about the dangers that faced people who questioned the government at that period. Very paranoid time when there was a real belief in this country on both sides, the establishment and the left, that a revolution could succeed in this country. And, when we look at it from the perspective of history, we saw that wasn't going to happen. Hoover was way off and thinking there was this big threat to the security of the country from the Black Panthers, who really, they organized the Koch brothers on the Black Bloc, but they were these deep intellectuals, really, and very interesting thinkers. I think the reason people still talk about the Black Panthers actually has a lot more to do with the 10-point program Mercy brought up and the thinking they had done, because they really were the first ones talking in New Haven about the effects of drug pushing and the relations to the police in the city, the effects of slumlording, the effects of sickle cell anemia. There's this whole, the breakfast program for kids that became city policy 15 years later. There was this whole set of issues that were ahead of their time, and they were much more intellectuals. Although part of the strategy was to enlist the people being left behind by radical organizing, the so-called boroughs on the block, people who were seriously thinking about the future of our country at a very divisive and upsetting time, felt that everybody was marked and anyone could get killed by the power of the state without evidence.
Thousands of supporters of the Panthers arrive in New Haven ahead of May Day in 1970 for a mass demonstration against the trials. Paul calls this the trial of the century in New Haven. Mercy, based on the people you interviewed for your podcast, why do you think this struck a chord with so many people?
Well, I think a lot of things were going on at the time. We sometimes forget that there are Black students at Yale, and Black students at Yale were paying attention at the time. The Black Student Association at Yale, or BSA, was paying attention at the time, and not only were they paying attention to the national temperature with the Black Panther Party, but they were paying attention to the trials and trying to figure out how they can be as supportive as possible. And so two individuals that I ended up speaking to for the podcast were Kurt Schmoke and Ralph Dawson, who were the president and vice president of BSA at the time, and they were rallying the Black Student Union, or BSA at the time, to come out and descend on New Haven's Green, descend on the court steps.
And a lot of what we were hearing in the run-up to this thing was that Yale might get torn apart. And I think that the consensus we had on that was that that was probably not the best thing either. We were there to change Yale, not to destroy Yale.
Lots of things are converging at the same time. It's May Day, right? It's the New Haven 9 trial. BSA is paying attention. And so there was a rising increase in the temperature, particularly with Black radicals, of course. But then for the first time, perhaps, right, individuals in New Haven who were paying attention, but maybe not involved with the Black Panther Party, because like Paul said, it had only been around for about 6 months up until the murder of Alex Rackley. You have individuals who are seeing the good that the party was doing with the 10-point program, the breakfast program, and various other things, right? So you had individuals wanting to be involved. When you think of the Hill Parents Association, I talked to Elise Brown, who was a young person at the time, who said her mother didn't want her to be a part of the party, but she, went out on her own. Her mother didn't want her to descend on New Haven's Green during the trial, but she went on her own. So there was this moment where young Black activists or organizers or individuals who were just interested in their own liberation were all converging on New Haven at the same time.
As you mentioned earlier, Paul, there were concerns that this might explode into violence on May Day. Why didn't we see those concerns about unrest realized?
I believe that there was this incredible conspiracy in New Haven to have New Haven not blow up and not let Richard Nixon, who would send emissaries into the city and given orders to the National Guard that they would not get in trouble for killing protesters, to make sure that that didn't succeed. So in the daytime, the police were wiretapping everyone at Yale and the Panthers. The Panthers were attacking Yale and the police. At nighttime, they were secretly meeting, along with the white radicals, Jerry Rubin, in the home of Yale's president on Hill House Avenue, about how they're going to make sure that there wasn't violence. As I said earlier, Bobby Seale reported a tape from prison that they played in the car, just telling people not to commit violence because there were provocateurs the government was sending to try to have there be violence, an excuse for a bloodbath. A bomb went off at Ingalls Rink during an event that night, during that weekend when there was a dance party, and luckily there were 2 stages set up and everyone was a different stage. The people I've spoken to are pretty convinced this was a white motorcycle gang from maybe the Valley that was working in tandem with the FBI, perhaps. And a bomb went off inside the basement of New Politics Corner, which is a liberal group near the Green. But they kept a lid on it so that there wasn't the pretext for people to get shot. And the National Guard's people themselves were very scared. They were young too. And as I said, it was the next day, May 2nd. It was actually a boring rally. They shut the rally down a day early. So the next day they went to Jackson State where there was a rally and 2 people were shot dead, young protesters, by the National Guard. That didn't get much attention because those were Black people. Then on May 4th, 4 white anti-war protesters were shot dead unarmed at Kent State. And that became the huge event of that period with the movie, songs, all that kind of stuff. And that was supposed to happen in New Haven. And I'm convinced after research I did, my story, COINTEL profiles that were opened up, interviews I did with the planners, that this was the best kind of conspiracy among people who were trying to thwart each other when the sun was out to make sure that New Haven didn't become the site of the bloodbath. I mean, the whole city was boarded up. Yale canceled classes early. The store fronts, the owners left town, took their families out of town. Broadway was all boarded up. And the Black community was very scared because they knew that once the white radicals who organized the rallies left town, they'd be the ones who'd get beat up. So they had all these medics set up around town. They urged people to stay away from the Green. And in the end, there were a lot fewer arrests than a typical day in New Haven and very few medical calls. The city really united around wanting this to go okay. Doctors volunteered their time and clinics. And it was I think that was kind of a shining moment in New Haven, as was the outcome of the trial.
We're hearing about how New Haven reacted to this and how Yale, the staff at large, and the president reacted to this. Mercy, what did Kurt Schmoke and Ralph Dawson tell you about the student body at Yale and what they thought about it? The student body at large, not just BSA.
Yeah, so there was a lot in the way of dissonance on the campus of Yale. So the student body was afraid, but also this was May Day. They wanted to be a part of it. B-Say was the primary focus of the podcast with Kurt Schmoke and Ralph Dawson. But effectively, they were thrust into the center stage of the conversation. So, Ted Kennedy came to campus, and there's this amazing picture with Ralph Dawson and Kurt Schmoke where they sort of take over and start speaking about what they want to see for the student body and the Black students on campus. And so there was this moment on campus where students were getting involved. Students were already involved. The Black students that were already involved in the Black Panther Party were kind of taking up the mantle and showing folks in New Haven how they wanted to remain involved for the city. And so when I talked to Ralph Dawson and Kurt Schmoke, who are still actively fighting for a lot of the issues that they were fighting for as students, what they were mostly concerned about was that there was solidarity between the university and the city.
It was interesting to me also is how this was among the first classes of Black students admitted when Yale had decided it was going to try to be less racist in its admissions. So the president of Yale had decided he wanted to move to a meritocracy rather than just kids of alumni who get to come here. And he specifically brought a lot more Black students here. And those first Black students, Kurt Schmoke became the mayor of Baltimore, Skip Gates, you're familiar with him, and Skip Gates. And Gates wrote an essay about that when this all happened with the Black Panthers, they felt caught in the middle because there was all this pressure on them as the so-called talented 10th, that they were the first ones being let inside the gates of the academy in any significant numbers. And were they going to could they prove that they weren't turning their backs on their roots in the community? And at the same time, they had all this pressure to succeed in that way. And May Day tore them apart in both directions. As Mercy said, it became very important. They became a crucial voice in both speaking to Yale's administration and faculty to demonstrate the importance of what was going on here and in the community and bring those concerns there, and to work toward monitors of the trial and on May Day itself to try to prevent violence. And they were clearly some of the heroes of that story.
Paul, wrap this up quickly for us as we finish up the segment. What happened to Warren Kimbrough in the court of law? What about Huggins, and what about Seal?
So Warren Kimbrough is one of the people who committed the murder, and they don't know which bullet actually killed him. And he had been a leader of the local party after being part of the establishment. He had grown up here and was running an anti-poverty program, then concluded that the liberalism of the reform movements was really just another way for white liberals to keep in charge of the Black community, became radicalized, became part of the murder. He immediately admitted what he had done. He felt it was wrong. He got the shortest trial in the history of Connecticut for murder and went to Harvard to study education and came back to run the most successful ex-offender program in the state called Project More. He built it into a model for the country and spent the next decades helping hundreds of people coming out of prison turn around their lives the way he did.
And Seal and Huggins?
Seal continued to tour for the rest. The Black Panthers kind of petered out, but he continued to be a lecturer for many years. He wrote books. He sold barbecue sauce, retained a sense of humor and intelligence. Erica Huggins, they all settled in Oakland. The Black Panther Party made its final stand in Oakland. She ran programs there, ran a school. Then when the Black Panthers kind of had their day, she continued being involved in social justice activism and other kinds of civic groups out there. She still lives in Oakland.
This is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're going to be back with more on how the Black Panther trials still resonate today.